In 2015, the monsoon failed across central India, and the price of chickpeas began to climb silently toward a number nobody expected. By early 2016, the global benchmark price for chickpeas had surged 55%, from $450 per ton to more than $700. India grew 70% of the world's chickpeas, and the drought had cut its harvest to the bone. Warehouses stood empty across Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, the two largest producing states. The Food and Agriculture Organization tracked the spike in its November 2016 Food Outlook report and flagged the fragility of the entire supply chain. A single weather event in a single region had sent shockwaves through markets from Karachi to Cairo to Mexico City. Millions of households across South Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, suddenly faced protein costs they could not afford. The crisis was not a freak accident. It was a warning written into the structure of the crop itself. Yet the chickpea is one of the oldest domesticated plants on Earth, a legume that humans have cultivated for roughly 10,000 years. Its story reaches back to the very beginning of farming, to the moment when hunter-gatherers in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains first bent wild plants to human will. That ancient pedigree should have made it one of the most resilient foods in the human diet, a survivor of every drought and flood and war that history could throw at it. The reality is far darker. The history of the chickpea is not a story of stability and abundance. It is a story of hidden costs stacked up over millennia. Poverty was built into its cultivation from the start, because the plant thrived on marginal soils where nothing else would grow, and the people assigned to tend it had no better ground to farm. Forced cultivation followed, as empires and landlords discovered that a legume requiring minimal inputs could be extracted from peasant laborers at maximum volume. And an ecological debt accumulated quietly beneath the surface of every field, a debt that the plant's own biology should have canceled, but that human systems refused to allow. For all its apparent simplicity, the chickpea shaped civilizations. It fed the builders of the first cities in the Fertile Crescent. It provisioned Roman legions marching across the empire. It sustained medieval monasteries and Islamic courts and Renaissance papal kitchens. It crossed the Atlantic in the holds of Spanish ships and rooted itself in the soils of the New World. And at every stage, the same pattern repeated. The chickpea was prized by the powerful and depended upon by the poor, celebrated in cookbooks and extracted as tax, elevated as cuisine and resented as a marker of desperation. That dual identity never resolved. It simply accumulated, layer upon layer, until the legume carried the weight of every society that had ever relied on it. The 2015 drought exposed what that weight had done. India's chickpea fields were not scattered across 100 resilient local landscapes anymore. They were concentrated in a handful of vast production zones, planted with varieties bred for yield rather than survival, dependent on groundwater that the monsoon had stopped replenishing. The crop that had weathered the collapse of the Roman Empire and the fall of Baghdad and the sieges of medieval Europe had been turned into a commodity optimized for industrial processing and global trade. And commodities break when the weather turns. That is the story this video will tell. Not the official version printed on packaging and celebrated in food festivals, but the documented reality buried in archaeological sites and tax records, and monastery garden plans and colonial ship manifests. It is the story of how a humble legume, a small round seed that most people barely notice in their soup or their hummus, became one of the quiet engineers of human civilization. And it is the story of how that legacy now threatens its future. Because the chickpea is not just ancient, it is exposed. And the question now is whether the same crop that survived 10,000 years of drought and empire and forced labor can survive the system humanity built around it. The wild ancestor of the chickpea was nothing like the pale, rounded seed that sits in a supermarket tin today. Cicer reticulatum grew in the rocky foothills of the Taurus Mountains in what is now southeastern Turkey. The plant was small and wiry, hugging the ground in a tangle of fine stems. Its seeds were tiny, no larger than a peppercorn, and mottled with dark brown and black markings. The pods were dehiscent, which is the botanist's way of saying they exploded. When the seeds ripened, the pod walls twisted and snapped, flinging the seeds outward across the soil. This was an elegant survival mechanism for a wild plant, a way to scatter its offspring as far as possible. It was a disaster for anyone trying to harvest them. A gatherer who approached a stand of wild Cicer reticulatum at the wrong moment would watch the entire crop vanish into the dirt in a single afternoon. Yet the foothills of the Taurus held something else that mattered far more than the plant's inconvenient biology. They held the conditions that would turn a wild legume into a crop. The terrain was rugged, cut by narrow valleys and limestone ridges that rose sharply from the surrounding plains. The soil was thin and well-drained, poor in organic matter and prone to drying out in the long Mediterranean summer. And Caesar reticulatum thrived in exactly that kind of poverty. It fixed its own nitrogen through a symbiosis with soil bacteria called rhizobia, drawing fertility from the air when the ground gave it nothing. It survived on the residual moisture trapped deep in the limestone cracks long after the last rain had evaporated. No other food plant in the region was so well adapted to neglect. This mattered because the people who first collected wild chickpeas, the hunter-gatherers of the early Neolithic, were not farmers yet. They were opportunists. They moved through the valleys of the upper Tigris and Euphrates, following game and seasonal wild harvests. Chickpeas were one of dozens of wild seeds they gathered, ground into paste on stone querns, and cooked over open fires. The earliest archaeological evidence of domesticated chickpeas comes from a settlement called Tel El-Kirk in northwestern Syria. Excavations in the pre-pottery Neolithic B layers there, radiocarbon dated to roughly 8,500 to 8,000 years before the Common Era, turned up something remarkable. Carbonized seeds, blackened and brittle from millennia buried in hearth ash and collapsed mudbrick, showed the unmistakable signs of domestication. The seeds were larger than the wild type. The seed coats were thinner and smoother. Their wild mottling faded toward a uniform pale brown. And crucially, the pods no longer shattered at maturity. The plant had been changed. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Something had happened in the generations between the wild gatherers and the inhabitants of Tel El-Kirk. People had begun selecting which seeds to save and which to plant again. A farmer noticed a plant whose pods held tight to the stem instead of flinging their seeds away. She saved those seeds and planted them the following year. Her daughter did the same. Her granddaughter did the same. Over dozens of generations, across hundreds of small settlements scattered through the Fertile Crescent, the explosive wild legume became a crop that waited for the harvester. The evidence of this transformation appears not just at Tel El-Kirk, but at two other sites that anchor the deep history of the chickpea. At Jericho, in the West Bank, archaeologists recovered domesticated chickpea remains from layers dated to approximately 7,500 BCE. Jericho was already ancient by then, a settlement with a massive stone tower and walls that had stood for thousands of years. Its inhabitants were among the earliest farmers anywhere on Earth, and chickpeas were part of their stored winter provisions. At Chayonu in southeastern Turkey, the site sits in the same foothills where the wild progenitor still grows. Excavations at Chayonu produced chickpea remains spanning a critical window, roughly 7,500 to 6,500 BCE. And these remains tell the story of domestication in progress. Some of the seeds from the earlier layers look almost wild, small, angular, with thickened seed coats. Others from the later layers are noticeably larger, rounder, and thinner-skinned. They are transitional forms, caught in the middle of the slow genetic shift from Cicer reticulatum to what would become Cicer arietinum. Archaeobotanists studying the Chayonu material documented both morphologies in the same settlement, sometimes in the same storage pit. The transformation was not instant, and it was not planned. It was the accumulated result of thousands of anonymous planting decisions made by people who left no names and no written records. Their legacy is written in the seeds themselves. The chickpea was not domesticated in isolation. It was one of a suite of plants that archaeologists now call the 8 founder crops of Near Eastern Neolithic agriculture. The list includes emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentil, pea, bittervetch, flax, and chickpea. These 8 species formed the agricultural package that emerged from the Fertile Crescent beginning roughly 10,000 years ago. Together, they enabled the shift from mobile foraging to permanent village life. Together, they provided the caloric surplus and the stored protein that made the first towns, the first temples, and the first bureaucracies possible. And the chickpea played a specific role in that package that none of the cereals could fill. Cereals provide carbohydrate calories, the energy to fuel a growing population. Pulses provide protein, the building blocks of muscle, and the buffer against famine when grain stores run low. A village that grew only wheat was one failed harvest from starvation. A village that grew wheat plus chickpeas had a second line of defense. The domestication process also selected for traits that made the crop easier to cook and digest. Wild chickpea seeds contain higher concentrations of compounds called anti-nutritional factors, substances that interfere with digestion and can cause discomfort if eaten in quantity. The selection for thinner seed coats and larger seeds over thousands of years accidentally reduced some of these compounds. Farmers were choosing for yield and ease of processing. They ended up producing a more digestible food without knowing it. By the time the fully domesticated chickpea appears in the archaeological record across the Near East, it had acquired a distinctive shape. The seed was rounded, slightly angular at one end, with a beaked protrusion that gave it an unmistakable profile. Pliny the Elder would later name it Cicer arietinum, the ram's head chickpea, because that beaked seed reminded Roman observers of a ram's horn curling back against the skull. But the Romans would not encounter the crop for another 8,000 years. The first farmers of the Taurus foothills and the Syrian plains had no Latin names for what they grew. They only knew that this particular legume, the one whose pods held fast and whose seeds swelled plump in the cooking pot, was worth keeping. The crop did not stay in its birthplace for long. By 6,000 years before the Common Era, it had already reached the shores of Greece. The evidence lies inside a limestone cavern on the eastern Peloponnese called Frankthi Cave. Archaeologists excavating its deep layers in the late 20th century recovered carbonized chickpea seeds from deposits dated to roughly 6,000 BCE. The cave overlooked a sheltered bay where the first Neolithic migrants from Anatolia beached their boat. These travelers carried seed stock, grinding stones, and the knowledge of settled agriculture across the Aegean Sea. Frankthi Cave had been occupied intermittently for 20,000 years before their arrival. Earlier inhabitants were hunter-gatherers who left behind flint tools and the bones of deer and tuna. The newcomers brought wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and a small, pale legume that none of the native foragers had ever seen. They planted the chickpea in the thin soils above the cave, close to the barley and the emmer. The grains recovered from those Neolithic deposits were indistinguishable from the fully domesticated forms already known at Chionu and Jericho. The domestication was complete. The chickpea had crossed open water and established itself on another continent. The journey from the Near East to Europe was not a single migration but a slow, generational pulse of farming communities spreading west. Each village planted the seeds they had carried from the last valley and saved a portion of the harvest to carry further. The legume required no special irrigation and tolerated soil too poor for wheat. It found a niche in the rocky limestone hillsides of the Aegean, where other crops struggled. By 4000 BCE, chickpea cultivation had radiated from Greece into the Balkans and up the Danube corridor. But in the arid lands of Egypt, the crop followed a different route entirely. Chickpeas arrived in the Nile Valley by the time of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE. The earliest direct evidence comes not from a kitchen floor, but from a tomb. In the burial chamber of Pharaoh Ramesses II at Thebes, excavators found desiccated chickpeas among the provisions left for the king's journey through the afterlife. The dry desert air had preserved them for over 3,000 years, their wrinkled skins still intact, their beaked profiles unmistakable. Ramesses died in 1213 BCE after a reign of 66 years. His architects cut a tomb into the Valley of the Kings and filled it with everything a god-king might require in eternity: furniture, jewelry, chariots, weapons, and food. Chickpeas were part of that funerary inventory because they were a staple of the Egyptian diet, boiled into stews or ground into flour. The legume appears in other New Kingdom contexts beyond royal tombs. Archaeobotanists have identified chickpea remains in workers' villages, in temple storage magazines, and in refuse pits behind the mud brick houses of ordinary Egyptians. The Nile floods deposited fresh silt annually, refreshing the fields, but chickpeas could be sown after the waters receded and harvested before the summer heat set in. They fit neatly into the agricultural rhythm of the pharaonic state, providing protein in the months between grain harvests. The crop also left a mark further west, in the volcanic soil of Campania. At the foot of Mount Vesuvius, the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum sat on some of the richest farmland in the Roman world. And on a summer day in 79 CE, a column of ash and gas rose from the mountain and buried both towns in hours. Everything that could burn did burn, but some things carbonized instead of turning to ash, and those blackened remains survived. Among them were chickpea seeds, found in Dolia, the large terracotta storage jars that line the pantries of Pompeian houses. Archaeologists have recovered these carbonized chickpeas from at least a dozen locations across the two towns. They were sitting in kitchen vessels, in closed storerooms, in the back of a tavern on the Via dell'Abbondanza. The context tells a straightforward story. Chickpeas were not a luxury item reserved for the wealthy. They were everyday fare, bought in markets, boiled in bronze pots, and ladled into bowls for shopkeepers, bakers, and dock workers. Herculaneum, the smaller of the two towns, preserved an even finer level of detail because the pyroclastic surge that buried it carbonized foodstuffs instantly at high heat. There, excavators found chickpeas still inside a cloth sack, the weave of the fabric pressed into the charred surface of the legume. The sack sat on the floor of a modest house with no atrium and no garden, just two rooms facing the street. The occupants had no fields. They bought their food from traders, and those traders bought from producers who grew chickpeas in the volcanic soil that ringed Vesuvius. By the 1st century of the Common Era, the ram's head legume was so familiar to Romans that they gave it a proper Latin name. Pliny the Elder, writing his vast Naturalis Historia around 77 CE, included a chapter on pulse crops in Book 18. He distinguished several types of chickpea, the common pale variety, a smaller darker type, and a third whose color he described as something between red and black. He noted their typical sowing periods, their hardiness in dry ground, and their tendency to exhaust the soil if planted in the same field too often. And he recorded that one particular variety was called Cicer arietinum, because its seed, swollen and beaked and faintly wrinkled, looked exactly like the head of a ram. Long before Pliny committed that description to parchment, a Greek thinker had already studied the same plant with a sharper eye. Theophrastus of Erissos wrote his Enquiry into Plants around 300 years before the Common Era. He was a student of Aristotle and succeeded him as head of the Lyceum in Athens. His botanical works catalogued hundreds of species with a precision that no one in the Mediterranean world had attempted before. In Book 8 of the Enquiry, he turned his attention to the legume that farmers across the Greek-speaking world already knew well. Theophrastus noted that chickpeas came in two distinct colors. One type produced pale, whitish seeds. Another bore seeds that were dark, almost black. He observed that the white kind was milder in flavor and easier to cook. The black variety was harder, took longer to soften in the pot, and left a stronger aftertaste. But the most striking observation Theophrastus recorded was not about taste. He wrote that chickpeas exhausted the soil more than any other pulse crop. Fields that had grown chickpeas for a season produced weaker grain the following year. The plants themselves seemed to pull something vital from the earth and leave nothing behind. Theophrastus did not know what nitrogen was. He could see only the visible consequence: stunted wheat, thin barley, a harvest that shrank year after year. Farmers in Attica learned to rotate chickpeas onto fallow ground and move them again before the soil gave out. The observation entered the written record and stayed there, passed from one agricultural writer to the next for centuries. 300 years after Theophrastus, a Roman landowner named Columella put the same warning into Latin. Lucius Junius Moderatus Columella was born in Gades, the Roman port city now called Cadiz, on the Atlantic coast of Spain. He served in the Roman army, but his enduring obsession was agriculture. Around the year 60 of the Common Era, he completed a 12-volume work titled De Re Rustica. It was the most comprehensive farming manual the Roman world ever produced. Book 2 dealt with field crops, and chickpeas received their own precise instructions. Columella advised sowing chickpeas in March, when the soil had dried and warmed after winter rains. He recommended loose, well-drained ground, the kind of gravelly soil that wheat struggled in. The legume needed no manure, he wrote. It actually did worse in heavily fertilized fields, growing too much leaf and too little seed. But the critical rule was rotation. Columella repeated the warning that Theophrastus had first recorded. Chickpeas ravaged the soil. He used a specific Latin phrase to describe the effect: terrae vires exauriunt. They drained the strength from the land. A farmer who planted chickpeas in the same plot 2 years running was courting ruin. The manual advised a gap of at least 2 seasons before returning the crop to the same ground. Columella wrote for estate owners, not for peasants. His readers commanded latifundia worked by enslaved laborers and tenant farmers. They wanted maximum yield from every ayujiram of soil, and chickpeas had to earn their place in the rotation. The agronomist calculated that a ayujiram of decent ground produced roughly 3 modi of chickpeas at harvest. That was about 26 liters of dried seed, enough to feed a household through the winter if supplemented with grain and oil. While Columella was writing for wealthy landowners, a contemporary of his was cataloging the chickpea for a different purpose entirely. Pedanius Dioscorides served as a physician in the Roman army under the Emperor Nero. He traveled with the legions across Greece, Asia Minor, and the eastern provinces, collecting plants and recording their medical uses. Around 65 CE, he compiled his findings into a 5-volume work called De Materia Medica. It became the most influential pharmacological text in the Western world for the next 1,500 years. In Book 2, Dioscorides devoted a short entry to the chickpea. He noted that the legume was not merely food, but medicine. Boiled chickpeas, mashed into a warm paste and applied to the skin, drew out inflammations and soothed ulcerated sores. A poultice made with chickpea flour and honey cleaned infected wounds and reduced swelling. But Dioscorides also recorded a more specific application. A decoction of chickpeas, simmered slowly in water until the liquid thickened, could be drunk to break up kidney stones and flush them from the body. He advised taking the decoction on an empty stomach, first thing in the morning, and following it with a cup of warm wine. Whether the treatment actually worked is beyond the scope of the archaeological record. But Roman physicians prescribed it routinely for centuries, and the recipe survived in medical manuscripts copied by monks and Arab translators long after the empire fell. By the time Dioscorides was compiling his remedies, chickpeas had become so ordinary that a poet could use them as shorthand for a poor man's dinner. Quintus Horatius Flaccus, Horace to modern readers, lived through the transformation of Rome from republic to empire. He fought on the losing side at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, lost his family estate, and spent years scrambling for patronage before his poetry won him the protection of Maecenas, the Emperor Augustus's wealthiest advisor. Horace knew what it meant to be poor, and when he wanted to evoke the simple life in his satires, written around 35 BCE, he reached for the chickpea. In the 6th satire of Book 1, he described his own humble origins. His father was a freedman, a former slave, who worked as a tax collector, an occupation that earned just enough to send his son to a decent school in Rome. Horace listed the meals of his childhood without embarrassment: a bowl of chickpeas, a dish of lentils, bread baked from coarse flour, torn and dipped in oil. 3 ingredients, he implied, that sustained the entire plebeian class of the late Republic. The passage was not a complaint. It was a quiet boast. The poet was reminding his wealthy readers that he came from nothing and owed his position to talent, not inheritance. But the mention of chickpeas was not accidental. Pliny, Columella, Dioscorides, Horace, 4 Roman writers in the span of a single century, all fixed the legume in the written record, and each located it in a different part of Roman life. The naturalist classified it. The agronomist optimized it. The physician prescribed it. The poet ate it. Together they documented a crop that had become so deeply embedded in the Mediterranean world that no single class or profession could claim ownership of it. The same seed that fed a freedman's son in a cramped apartment on the Esquiline Hill also boiled in the bronze pots of country villas and traveled in the medical kits of army surgeons on the Danube frontier. That ubiquity was about to become something far heavier. The written testimonies of the philosophers and poets described chickpeas as a subject of study, a dietary staple, and a humble comfort. What they did not record, what the documentary evidence would soon reveal, was that for millions of ordinary people across the Roman Empire, the chickpea was not a choice at all. It was an obligation measured out in precise weights and recorded on government parchment. It was not. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, somewhere in the Egyptian district of Oxyrhynchus, a government clerk dipped his reed pen into a pot of carbon black ink and wrote down what a tenant farmer owed. The document he produced survived the collapse of the empire that commissioned it. It outlasted the language it was written in. And in the early 20th century, archaeologists pulling papyrus scraps from the dry rubbish mounds of the ancient city found it again. The papyrus was catalogued as P. Oxy, 1119. It was not a literary work or a religious text. It was a tax receipt. The document recorded that a tenant named Aurelius Serapion, farming land owned by a wealthy landlord near the village of Seriphus, had handed over a specified weight of dried chickpeas to the imperial authorities. The amount was measured in ardabas, the standard Egyptian grain measure. The delivery was not voluntary. It was a compulsory requisition levied under the Annona system, the vast imperial machinery that extracted food from the provinces to feed the army and the population of Rome. Serapion's chickpeas were bundled into sacks, loaded onto donkeys or Nile barges, and funneled into the same supply chains that moved Egyptian wheat across the Mediterranean. The papyrus recorded no complaint from the farmer. It recorded no gratitude from the state. It was a cold line item in an empire that ran on cold line items. This is the reality the Roman agronomists never wrote about. Columella described chickpea cultivation from the estate owner's perspective: when to sow, how to rotate, what yield to expect per ugerum. His reader wanted to maximize profit. The tenant who actually worked the soil appeared nowhere in De Re Rustica. But in the documentary record, in the tax papyri and the land registries and the requisition orders, the tenant was everywhere. For millions of provincial farms, barley filled the gap when wheat ran short. But chickpeas, hardy, drought-tolerant, willing to grow on ground too thin for cereals, were the safety net that caught the poorest farmers at the bottom of the system. A tenant who could not meet his wheat quota could sometimes substitute chickpeas. The substitution rate was punishing. The state knew the market value of each crop and calculated the exchange accordingly. A farmer who substituted chickpeas for wheat handed over more bushels for the same tax obligation. He solved one problem by creating another. The legumes that paid his taxes were the legumes his own family did not eat. The choice was simple: hand over the chickpeas and stay on the right side of the imperial ledger, or withhold them and face the consequences. The consequences were not abstract. Roman tax collection in Egypt was enforced by local officials backed by soldiers. A tenant in arrears could lose his seed stock, his tools, or his tenancy. In the worst cases, he could lose his freedom. Debt bondage was illegal under Roman law, but in practice, impoverished farmers who could not pay their obligations found ways to fall through the gaps in the legislation. The chickpea that sustained the Roman army on the Danube frontier also kept the Egyptian tenant awake at night. This pattern did not end when the Western Empire fell. It simply put on new clothes. In 1427, the government of the Republic of Florence conducted one of the earliest comprehensive tax surveys in European history. The catasto, the word means a register or ledger, required every household in Florentine territory to declare its income, its assets, its debts, and the composition of its family. The records survive in the state archives of Florence, filling hundreds of leather-bound volumes. Historians have studied the catasto for its detail on Renaissance wealth, on social structure, on the distribution of land and capital. But the catasto also recorded what poor people ate. In the rural communes of Tuscany, in the Mezzadria sharecropping farms that dotted the hills between Florence and Siena, the tax declarations told a story the official chronicles left out. When the grain harvest failed, and it failed often, peasant families reported that their primary sustenance came from chickpea flour. Not bread, not wheat. Chickpeas ground into a coarse meal, mixed with water, and cooked into a dense porridge or a hard flat cake. The wood-fired ovens of the poderi did not go cold during shortages. They simply baked something humbler. The catasto declarations reveal a clear hierarchy of hunger. In years of plenty, wheat bread dominated the peasant diet, supplemented by vegetables, olive oil, and small amounts of cured meat. In years of moderate scarcity, chestnut flour entered the equation. The forests of the Apennines produced chestnuts in abundance, and the flour could be stretched into a rough polenta called necchio. But in the worst years, when the wheat crop and the chestnut harvest both failed, the peasant household fell back on the chickpea. The catasto commissioners recorded it without drama. Flour made from sessi, the sole protein source for an entire familia colonica. The pattern was so consistent across the 15th century surveys that it became a marker the tax assessors used to identify households in distress. If a sharecropping family declared chickpea flour as its principal foodstuff, the assessor knew the farm was on the edge. The legume that Columella optimized and Dioscorides prescribed had become, a millennium and a half later, the food of last resort. And yet, and this is where the story refuses to simplify, the same chickpea also appeared on the tables of wealthy Florentine merchants. Renaissance cookery manuscripts from the same century included recipes for setzi cooked with saffron, rosemary, and expensive spices imported from the Levant. The pulse that sustained the starving sharecropper through the winter months was also served, in a vastly more refined form, at the banquets of the urban elite. The distance between the two versions of the dish was not culinary. It was measured in land ownership, in tax obligations, and in the brutal arithmetic of who grew the food and who consumed it. The sharecropper handed over half his harvest to the padrone, who owned the land. What remained had to feed his family through the winter, with chickpeas filling the gap that grain could not cover. The Florentine merchant bought chickpeas by the sack at the Mercato Vecchio and paid a cook to transform them into something a Medici might recognize. The same seed, the same fields, the same Tuscan soil, and two completely different relationships to the food. This duality had been baked into the chickpea since the Neolithic farmers of Tel El Kirk first selected for larger seeds and non-shattering pods. The crop was always both a blessing and a marker of desperation. It was prized by the powerful and depended upon by the poor. It was celebrated in the agronomy manuals and omitted from the poetry of the well-fed. The tension between official praise and lived reality never resolved itself. It simply persisted, century after century, government after government, from the tax rolls of Roman Egypt to the catasto ledgers of Renaissance Tuscany. And it was about to enter a new chapter entirely. Far to the north, in the cold halls of a Frankish palace, a king was preparing to issue orders that would shape the future of the chickpea for the next 1,000 years. In the year 795, from his palace at Aachen, the Frankish king Charlemagne issued a set of orders that would reach every corner of his sprawling empire. The document was called the Capitulare Divilis. It was not a grand philosophical treatise or a legal code for the ages. It was an administrative manual, a detailed set of instructions for the stewards who managed the royal estates scattered across Francia. The Capitulare listed, with remarkable specificity, exactly what each imperial villa was required to grow. Fruit trees, medicinal herbs, vegetables, and legumes all received their own entries. And among the legumes, one item appeared by name, Cicer, the chickpea. The 70 articles of the Capitulare left nothing to the discretion of local stewards. Each estate was ordered to maintain gardens containing specific plants, and the chickpea was mandatory. The reasoning was not culinary preference or royal taste. Charlemagne was building an empire that could feed itself without relying on vulnerable trade routes or the unpredictable harvests of distant provinces. The chickpea was a crop that stored well, tolerated poor soils, and provided protein through the lean months of a northern winter. A steward who failed to plant Cicer in the villa garden was failing at his job. And the capitularies were not suggestions. They were royal commands backed by the authority of a king who had been crowned Emperor of the Romans by the Pope himself. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. By mandating chickpea cultivation across the imperial estates, Charlemagne embedded the legume into the agricultural infrastructure of medieval Europe. The plant that had sustained Roman legionaries and Egyptian tenant farmers was now, by decree, part of the Frankish food system. Monasteries were paying attention. 3 decades before Charlemagne issued the Capitular Divilis, the Benedictine monastery of St. Gall, nestled in the alpine foothills of what is now Switzerland, had already begun designing a blueprint for the ideal monastic community. The plan of St. Gall, drawn around the year 820 on 5 sheets of parchment stitched together, was not a map of an existing building. It was a vision. The plan depicted an entire monastic complex in precise detail. The church, the cloister, the dormitories, the workshops, the brewery, the infirmary, and critically, the gardens. In the vegetable plot, labeled with the same meticulous care as the chapel or the scriptorium, the plan marked out a specific bed. It was called the Cicerarius, the chickpea garden. The monks who drafted the plan understood that a self-sufficient monastery needed protein that did not depend on livestock. Chickpeas could be dried after harvest and stored in the granary for months. They could be soaked overnight and boiled into pottage when fresh vegetables were unavailable. They required no special equipment, no complex processing, no expensive spices to become edible. The Cicerarius was not a decorative feature or a botanical curiosity. It was a functional piece of infrastructure, as essential to the monastery's survival as the bakehouse or the well. The monks of St. Gall were not growing chickpeas as an exotic import from the Mediterranean. They were growing them as a practical solution to the problem of feeding a large community through the alpine winter. The seed they planted in the Cicerarius was the same species that Pliny had named, that Columella had advised to sow in dry, loose ground, that Dioscorides had prescribed for kidney stones. But the context had shifted entirely. The chickpea was no longer just a crop of the Mediterranean basin. It was climbing northward, carried by imperial decree and monastic discipline into the cold valleys of Central Europe. And then, far to the south, in the gardens of Al-Andalus, the chickpea was about to receive its most sophisticated treatment yet. The Arab agriculturalist Ibn al-Awwam lived and worked in Seville during the 12th century. Islamic Spain was, at that moment, one of the most agriculturally advanced societies on earth. The irrigation systems built by Arab engineers had transformed the Guadalquivir Valley into a patchwork of productive farms, orchards, and market gardens. And Ibn al-Awwam documented all of it. His Kitab al-Filah, it was a practical manual, the summation of centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to grow food in a dry climate. The chapter on chickpeas ran for several dense pages. Ibn al-Awwam described 3 cultivated varieties, distinguished by the color of their seeds. The large white chickpea was the most prized, the sweetest and most tender after cooking. The red chickpea was smaller but hardier, tolerating poorer soils and drier conditions. The black chickpea was the toughest of the 3, with a stronger flavor and a thicker seed coat that required longer soaking. Each variety had its place in the agricultural system, and Ibn al-Awwam advised the farmer on exactly how to treat each one. His instructions on sowing were precise and born of long experience. Before planting in sandy soil, the farmer was to flood the field and let the water soak deep into the ground. This pre-irrigation created a reservoir of moisture beneath the surface that would sustain the young plants through their early growth. Once the soil was damp but no longer waterlogged, the seeds went into the ground. The roots would follow the retreating moisture downward, anchoring the plants and giving them access to water that surface irrigation alone could not provide. Ibn al-Awwam also insisted on crop rotation. Chickpeas, he noted, could not be grown year after year in the same field. The soil needed rest. A field that had produced chickpeas one season should be planted with something else the next, and the chickpeas should not return for several years. This was not a new observation. Theophrastus had said it. Columella had said it. Every farmer who had ever worked with chickpeas knew it. What Ibn al-Awwam provided was a systematic framework, a set of rules that could be taught and replicated across different soils and climates. The knowledge that had been scattered across Greek, Latin, and Arabic traditions was now gathered into a single, comprehensive manual. A farmer in 12th century Andalusia who followed Ibn al-Awwam's instructions could grow chickpeas more reliably and more productively than a Roman farmer had managed 1,000 years earlier. The crop was moving north and south simultaneously, spreading through the medieval world along 2 separate vectors. In the north, Charlemagne's decrees and the monastic gardens of the Benedictines carried the chickpea into the Frankish heartland. In the south, the agricultural science of Al-Andalus refined its cultivation into an art. The seed itself did not change. It was still Cicer arietinum, still the ram-headed legume that Pliny had named. But the system around it was growing more complex, more organized, more intentional. The humble pulse that had once been gathered from wild plants in the Taurus foothills was now being engineered into the agricultural foundation of an entire continent. And the consequences of that engineering were only beginning to unfold. By the middle of the 16th century, the chickpea had climbed from monastic gardens into the highest kitchen in Christendom. Bartolomeo Scopi served as personal cook to Pope Pius V. Scopi was not a minor figure in culinary history. He was the most famous chef in Renaissance Europe. His Opera dell'arte del cucinare, published in Venice in 1570, ran to over 1,000 pages. The book contained more than 1,000 recipes, organized into 6 books covering everything from butchery to pastry. It included detailed engravings of kitchen equipment. It listed the proper kitchen staff for a noble household. It specified the seasonal ingredients required for each dish. It was the most comprehensive cookbook produced in Europe since the Roman era. And in the chapter on pulse pottages, Scopi gave the chickpea its due. He included a recipe for minestra di ceci, a chickpea soup. The instructions were precise. Dried chickpeas were to be soaked overnight in cold water. The next morning, they went into a pot with fresh water, oil, salt, and pepper. Scapi specified that the soup should simmer slowly until the chickpeas were tender enough to crush between the fingers. At the end, a dusting of cinnamon and a final pour of good oil finished the dish. He also included a recipe for ceci fritti, fried chickpeas. The boiled chickpeas were drained, dried, and dropped into hot oil until their skins crisped and blistered. They were served hot, sprinkled with salt and sometimes sugar. Scapi's recipes were not peasant food. They were dishes prepared for a pope. The same legume that Horace had dismissed as plebeian fare 15 centuries earlier was now being served on silver plates in the Vatican. But the chickpeas' transformation that century did not stop at the kitchen door. While Scapi was writing his recipes, the chickpea was crossing an ocean. In 1532, a Spanish fleet prepared to sail for the conquest of Peru. The expedition required ships capable of carrying men, horses, weapons, and enough food to sustain the journey across the Atlantic and the subsequent march into the Andes. A surviving inventory from that fleet listed the provisions loaded aboard. Among the barrels of salted pork, the sacks of hardtack, the jars of olive oil, the document recorded garbanzos, chickpeas. The Spanish and Portuguese navigators who crossed the Atlantic in the early 16th century faced a brutal provisioning problem. A ship at sea for weeks or months needed food that would not rot, would not sprout, and would not attract vermin. Dried chickpeas met all three requirements. They were hard as stones when raw. They could sit in a barrel in the hold for months without spoiling. Soaked in seawater and boiled over a shipboard fire, they became edible. A sailor could survive on them. A conquistador could march on them. The same logic that had made dried chickpeas valuable to Arab caravans crossing the Sahara now applied to Spanish galleons crossing the Atlantic. The seed that had traveled from Anatolia to Greece, from Greece to Rome, from Rome to Andalusia, was now traveling to the Americas. The Atlantic crossing took chickpeas to a world where no one had ever seen them before. The crop found new soil quickly. By the late 16th century, chickpeas were widely cultivated in the highlands of central Mexico. The climate of the Mexican plateau, with its dry season and its volcanic soils, suited the plant. Spanish colonial authorities encouraged indigenous farmers to grow chickpeas as a food source for mining towns and urban settlements. The legume spread through the Caribbean as well. On the island of Hispaniola, on Cuba, on Puerto Rico, chickpea plants took root in the gardens of Spanish colonists and in the provision grounds of enslaved Africans. Within a few decades, the crop had become naturalized. A farmer in the valley of Oaxaca in 1590 could harvest chickpeas from plants whose ancestors had grown in a field near Seville. A cook in the port of Veracruz could prepare a chickpea soup using the same methods Scapi had described in his Roman kitchen. The Atlantic had not stopped the chickpea. It had multiplied it. The crop was now growing on 3 continents. And it was doing so just as the European diet was about to undergo its most dramatic transformation in centuries. By the middle of the 19th century, that transformation had reached the streets of Nice. The city sat on the French coast of the Mediterranean, a port town wedged between the sea and the foothills of the Alps. Its population was a mix of fishermen, dock workers, artisans, and the poor who served the wealthy winter visitors beginning to discover the Riviera. And in the late afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the day's labor ended, a particular smell began to drift through the narrow lanes of the old town. It was the scent of chickpea flour hitting hot copper. The vendors were local women, known as socairas. They worked from makeshift street stalls or carried their equipment balanced on their heads. The equipment was simple. A circular copper pan, broad and shallow, heated over a fire of wood or charcoal. Into that pan, they poured a thin batter of chickpea flour, water, olive oil, and salt. The batter hit the hot metal and sizzled instantly. The edges crisped and curled while the center stayed soft. When the surface blistered brown, the socairta slid the pancake onto a sheet of paper, sprinkled it with black pepper, and handed it to a waiting customer. It cost a few centimes. It was eaten standing up, with bare hands, straight off the paper. Workers ate it on their way home from the docks. Market porters ate it between loads. Children ate it after school. The dish was called soca. And for more than a century, it existed entirely in the oral culture of the city's poor. No cookbook recorded it. No gastronomic society praised it. It was not served in restaurants. It was street food, pure and simple. And the people who made it left almost no trace in the written record. Then, in 1863, a local almanac changed that. The publication was called Le Sorgentin. Its name meant the sunriser in Nissard, the Occitan dialect spoken in Nice. It was a small, cheaply printed annual aimed at the working people of the city. It contained weather predictions, planting advice, local news, jokes, songs, and recipes. And in its pages, for the first time anywhere in print, soca was described. The entry was brief. It noted the practice of baking thin chickpea crepes in broad copper pans set directly over an open fire. It described the batter, the technique, the way the pancake was shaved into rough pieces and eaten hot. It gave no precise measurements. It gave no origin story. It simply recorded what the Sokairas were already doing every day on the streets of the old town. The almanac's description mattered for one reason. It proved that soca was not a recent invention and not an import. It was an established, everyday food of the Niçois poor by the early 1860s. The dish almost certainly predated the written record by decades, perhaps longer. Nice had been part of the Kingdom of Sardinia until just 3 years before the almanac appeared. The city was annexed by France in 1860. Its food culture was a blend of Italian, Provençal, and its own fiercely local Niçois traditions. Chickpea flour had been milled in the region for centuries. The combination of flour, water, oil, and intense dry heat in a copper pan required no oven, no expensive ingredients, and almost no fuel. It was a food perfectly adapted to the resources of the poor. And it was not unique to Nice. Across the Mediterranean, chickpea flour was the backbone of an entire category of cheap, filling street foods. In Genoa, a few hundred kilometers east along the same coast, vendors sold farinata. The batter was identical: chickpea flour, water, olive oil, salt. It was baked in large rectangular copper trays in wood-fired ovens until the top blistered and the bottom crisp. It came out of the oven golden and fragrant, sliced into irregular wedges, and sold by weight. A laborer could buy a wedge of farinata for less than the price of bread. In Livorno, further down the Tuscan coast, the same dish was called torta di ceci. In Palermo, on the island of Sicily, street vendors sold panelle, fritters made from chickpea flour batter fried in oil and stuffed into bread rolls. In Marseille, just west of Nice, cooks poured chickpea batter into hot pans and called the result panis. In Algeria, across the water, the same principle produced karantika, a chickpea flan sold from handcarts in the working-class quarters of Oran and Algiers. The names changed from port to port. The technique did not. Chickpea flour, water, oil, heat. The same 4 ingredients, combined in slightly different proportions and cooked in slightly different shapes, fed the poor of the entire Western Mediterranean. This was not a coincidence. Chickpea flour was the cheapest protein available to a working family in the coastal cities of southern Europe and North Africa. Meat was a luxury. Cheese was expensive. Fresh fish cost money. But dried chickpeas could be bought in bulk, stored indefinitely, and milled into flour whenever needed. A kilo of chickpea flour cost a fraction of a kilo of wheat flour, and it provided more protein. A laborer who ate a wedge of soca or farinata had consumed roughly the same protein as a small piece of meat for a tenth of the price. The flour also required no leavening, no eggs, no butter, no milk. It bound with water alone. It crisped in oil. It kept a working man standing through an afternoon of hauling cargo or unloading fish. For the poor, it was not a delicacy. It was survival. And it was survival that had been built into the chickpea's biology 10,000 years earlier in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. The same dense protein structure that made the wild seeds viable through long dry seasons now made the flour a lifeline in the industrializing port cities of the 19th century. The grain had not changed. The system around it had simply grown larger and more unforgiving. The street vendors who sold soca on the corners of Old Nice did not know they were part of a chain stretching back to the Neolithic. They knew the price of chickpea flour. They knew the cost of wood for the fire. They knew how many centimes they needed to earn before the sun went down, and they kept working, day after day, feeding the city from copper pans heated over open flames, while the written record of their labor filled exactly 1 paragraph in a local almanac nobody outside Nice would read for another 100 years. The vendors in Nice knew nothing of this. They knew the price of flour and the cost of wood. They did not know that a man was coming who would trace their chickpea batter back 10,000 years to a handful of wild seeds in the mountains of Anatolia. His name was Nikolai Vavilov. He was born in Moscow in 1887, the son of a textile merchant. By his early 30s, he had already become the most ambitious plant explorer the world had ever seen. Vavilov did not simply collect seeds. He was hunting for a law of nature. He believed that the places where crops were first domesticated held the greatest diversity of their wild relatives and ancient forms. And he believed that finding those places would unlock the ability to breed stronger crops for the future. In 1926, Vavilov departed Leningrad for the Near East. He traveled by train, then by car, then on horseback and on foot. He crossed the Caucasus into what was then Persia. He followed ancient trade routes through the mountains of northern Iran. He descended into the valleys of Iraq. He pushed west into Syria. He was not alone on these journeys. A small team of Soviet botanists and agronomists accompanied him. Local guides led them through passes and along riverbeds. They slept in villages, in tents, in the open air beside their vehicles. And everywhere they stopped, Vavilov looked for chickpeas. He collected seeds from farmers' fields, from village markets, from the dusty margins of roadsides. He pressed specimens between sheets of paper. He labeled each accession with the date, the location, the altitude, the soil type, the name the farmer used for it. He filled canvas bags with dried pods. He shipped crates of material back to the Institute of Plant Industry in Leningrad. By the time the expedition concluded in 1927, Vavilov had amassed 1,500 distinct chickpea accessions from Iran, Iraq, and Syria alone. 1,500 distinct genetic variants of a single crop. No one had ever gathered anything close to that number. The sheer range of forms astonished him. Some chickpeas were pale and large, the size of a child's fingertip. Others were dark and tiny, barely bigger than a peppercorn. Some had thin seed coats that split easily in water. Others had thick, tough coats that required hours of soaking. Some were beige, some were black, some mottled brown, some deep reddish bronze. Each variant represented a branch of the chickpea's long genetic journey through human hands. Vavilov examined them all. He planted samples in experimental plots. He cross-referenced his collections with archaeological reports from dig sites across the Fertile Crescent. He studied the distribution of wild sisser species, and he came to a conclusion that formalized what millennia of farmers had already known without writing it down. The Near East was the primary center of origin for cultivated chickpeas. He published his findings in a theoretical framework he called the Law of Homologous Series in Variation. The idea was that closely related species showed parallel patterns of genetic variation. If you wanted to find disease resistance or drought tolerance in a crop, you went to its center of origin and collected every variant you could find. Chickpeas were a perfect test case. The wild progenitor, Sisser reticulatum, grew only in a narrow band of southeastern Turkey. The earliest domesticated forms clustered in exactly the same region. The diversity Vavilov documented in Iranian and Syrian markets was not random. It radiated outward from that Anatolian core, thinning with distance and time. The center of origin was also the center of genetic wealth. Vavilov's 1,500 chickpea accessions became the foundation of what would eventually be called a germplasm collection. The term meant something simple. It was a library of living seeds. Every accession carried a unique combination of genes: drought resistance from a village in Kurdistan, frost tolerance from a high-altitude field in the Zagros Mountains, resistance to a specific fungal blight from a farmer's plot outside Aleppo. Vavilov understood that these genes were irreplaceable. Once a local variety went extinct in the field, once farmers abandoned it for a modern commercial cultivar, its genes were gone forever. He was not simply cataloging the past. He was building an ark for the future. The seeds he collected were stored in Leningrad, kept cool and dry in vast seed banks. From there, they were sent to breeders across the Soviet Union. They were crossed with local varieties. They were tested for yield, for hardiness, for protein content. Vavilov's expedition catalyzed the first systematic chickpea breeding programs in modern history. He had taken a crop that farmers had selected by eye and hand for 10,000 years and brought it into the age of genetics. But even as his work advanced, the world around him was darkening. Joseph Stalin had consolidated power in the Soviet Union. Vavilov's scientific methods, grounded in Mendelian genetics and Darwinian selection, came into direct conflict with the state-sponsored pseudoscience of Trofim Lysenko. Lysenko rejected genetics entirely. He claimed that crops could be transformed within a single generation by altering their environment. He promised Stalin impossible harvests. Vavilov refused to endorse the fraud. He continued his collecting expeditions. He continued publishing data that contradicted Lysenko's claims. He continued defending the principle that genes, not ideology, determined what a plant could become. In 1940, while on a collecting expedition in Ukraine, Vavilov was arrested. He was tried in secret. The charge was sabotage of Soviet agriculture. The evidence was his own insistence that scientific truth mattered more than political obedience. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to 20 years in a labor camp. In the camp, Vavilov continued to give lectures on plant breeding to fellow prisoners. He described the centers of origin of wheat, of barley, of lentils, of chickpeas. He recited the geography of his expeditions from memory. He died of starvation in 1943 in the prison at Saratov, his body deposited in a common grave. But his seeds outlived him. The 1,500 chickpea accessions he had collected from Iran, Iraq, and Syria remained in the seed bank in Leningrad. They survived the war, the siege, the purges. They became the basis for chickpea breeding programs in India, in Australia, in Mexico, in Ethiopia. Every modern chickpea variety that resists fusarium wilt or tolerates drought carries genetic material that traces back to Vavilov's expeditions. This was his triumph. A man had walked through the markets and fields of the ancient world, gathered the genetic legacy of 10,000 years of farming, and preserved it for a future he would not live to see. The street vendors in Nice did not know his name, but the chickpea flour they poured into hot copper pans came from plants whose wild ancestors Vavilov had mapped to a hillside in Anatolia. The chain was now fully documented. The origin was no longer myth or guesswork. It was a precise coordinate on a scientific map, and the seeds that held the proof were sitting in a refrigerated vault in Russia, waiting. The seeds Vavilov had gathered sat in cold storage in Leningrad, waiting for a war that was already approaching. But 1,300 kilometers to the southwest, in the dry limestone plains of Puglia, a different kind of record was being set. The year was 1938. Italy harvested 69,000 tons of chickpeas. The number came from the Italian Central Statistical Institute, ISTAT. Its surveyors fanned out across 130,000 hectares of cultivated land. No single harvest in the history of the Mediterranean had ever been that large. The center of production was the heel of the Italian boot. Puglia stretched flat and stony between the Adriatic and the Ionian Sea. The soil was thin, pale, and crumbled underfoot. Rainfall was scarce outside the winter months. Olive trees silvered the ridges, and between the trees, in fields too poor for wheat, farmers planted chickpeas. The dominant variety was called Nero di Puglia, the black chickpea of Apulia. Its seeds were small, angular, and dark as wet slate. The seed coat was rough and thick. It needed a long soak before cooking, but it tolerated heat and dry soil in ways that larger varieties could not. Farmers had selected it over generations for exactly those traits. They sowed it in March, as Columella had advised in the 1st century. They planted it in ground that had not seen chickpeas in at least 2 seasons. They gave it no manure. The plants grew low to the earth, bushy and tough, with small purple flowers that gave way to swollen pods. Each pod held 1 or 2 seeds. The stems were covered in fine hairs that irritated bare skin at harvest time. In July, the plants turned brittle and brown under the southern sun. Workers pulled them by hand and piled them into sheaves on the dry ground. Threshing was done with stone rollers or the hooves of mules, turning in circles on packed earth. The chaff lifted on the wind and blew in pale clouds across the fields. What remained was a mound of dark seed. The 69,000 tons recorded by ISTAT represented the combined output of tens of thousands of small holdings. Most farmers grew chickpeas on marginal land that could not sustain a wheat crop. The calculus was ancient. Chickpeas extracted less from the soil than they gave back in nitrogen fixed by the root nodules. The plant could mine moisture from deep in the limestone fissures. A failed chickpea harvest was rare. A failed wheat harvest was catastrophe. So chickpeas were the insurance policy. They were also the food of the poor. Chickpea flour went into bread that stretched the costly wheat flour. Whole dried chickpeas went into soups and stews cooked over charcoal braziers. Boiled chickpeas with a thread of olive oil and a pinch of salt were a meal for field laborers at midday. The wealthier landowners exported the best of the crop to markets in Bari and Naples. The rest fed the families who had grown it. In 1938, the Italian government was actively promoting agricultural self-sufficiency. Benito Mussolini had announced the battle for grain in 1925. The regime poured subsidies into wheat. Land that had grown chickpeas for centuries was plowed under and sown with high-yielding grain varieties. But the thin limestone soils of Puglia resisted the transformation. Wheat burned in the summer heat. Chickpeas endured. So the black chickpea held its ground while other traditional crops retreated. The 1938 harvest was a statistical peak. It was also the last great bloom of an older agricultural world. The Nero di Puglia that filled the sacks at the cooperative warehouses was a landrace. That term meant something specific. It was not a uniform commercial variety bred in a research station. It was a population of plants with deep genetic diversity, shaped by the hands and eyes of farmers in individual villages across centuries. Every valley had its own strain. Every farmer saved seed from the best plants in the best corner of the field. The result was a mosaic of slightly different black chickpeas spread across the heel of Italy. Vavilov would have recognized it immediately. It was exactly the kind of diversity he had collected in the markets of Iran and Syria. The ISTAT surveyors, who tallied the 69,000 tons, did not catalog the genetic variation within the harvest. They counted sacks, not alleles. But the sacks themselves contained a living archive of adaptations. Resistance to the fusarium wilt that rotted roots in wet years. Tolerance for the alkaline soils that capped the limestone bedrock. The ability to set seed even when the spring rains failed. All of it was packed into those small black seeds, invisible to the census taker, invaluable to the farmer. The 1938 harvest moved through a network of local mills and wholesalers. Some of the crop was ground into flour for the farinata ovens of Bari and Lecce. Some was packed in jute sacks and shipped from the port of Brindisi. Some was held back for the spring sowing. No one at the time called it a peak. The farmers expected another harvest the following year, and another after that. They did not know they were standing at the high water mark. After 1938, the numbers began a long decline. The Second World War swept across the peninsula. Fields were abandoned. Mules were requisitioned. The post-war Italian agricultural miracle turned toward mechanization, irrigation, and industrial fertilizer. Chickpeas retreated to the driest and poorest corners of the landscape. The Nero di Puglia, that had fed generations, became a niche crop for local markets. Its genetic wealth was never fully cataloged. Much of it was simply lost. The field where an old farmer had grown his family's black chickpeas for 40 years was planted with durum wheat. The seed stock dried in a corner of a shed and was thrown away. The 1938 harvest was the largest because it represented the convergence of every force that had pushed chickpeas across the Mediterranean for 8,000 years. The crop was local, diverse, and resilient. It was grown by people who depended on it for survival, and it was about to be replaced. The 69,000 tons recorded by ISTAT was not a triumph. It was a notation. The seeds Vavilov had locked in the Russian vault held the genetic blueprint of the past. The fields of Puglia held the mass of the present, and the present in 1938 was larger than it had ever been. But the foundation was already eroding. The shift did not happen all at once. It happened season by season, field by field, as the old land races gave way to uniform varieties bred for industrial processing. By the second half of the 20th century, the geography of chickpea production had been completely redrawn. The Mediterranean basin, which had grown chickpeas for 8,000 years, became a minor player. A single nation had taken its place: India. By the early 21st century, India produced nearly 70% of the world's chickpeas. The figure was staggering. No other major food crop was so heavily concentrated in one country. The Indian subcontinent had grown chickpeas for millennia. Archaeological evidence places the crop in the Indus Valley by at least 2000 BCE. But the scale of modern production was something no ancient farmer could have imagined. The center of gravity was the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. Its black cotton soils and dry winter climate suited the crop perfectly. Farmers there planted chickpeas after the monsoon receded, using residual moisture stored in the heavy clay. The area under cultivation expanded rapidly in the decades after the Green Revolution. Irrigated wheat and rice took the best land. Chickpeas were pushed onto poorer soils and rain-fed margins. By 2015, Madhya Pradesh alone accounted for roughly 40% of India's total chickpea output. The crop had become a commodity in the purest sense. Village-level diversity had been replaced by a handful of high-yielding varieties developed by government breeding stations. Farmers bought certified seed each season instead of saving their own. The old practice of keeping back a portion of the harvest for next year's sowing had largely disappeared. The chickpea had been transformed from a locally adapted landrace into a standardized industrial input, and the global supply chain had reshaped itself around this single concentration of production. Importers in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia depended on Indian chickpeas to meet domestic demand. Pakistan, Bangladesh, the United Arab Emirates, Algeria, Egypt, all were major buyers. A disruption in Indian supply would ripple through markets worldwide. In the summer of 2015, the disruption arrived. The southwest monsoon, which normally drenched central India between June and September, failed. Rainfall across Madhya Pradesh and neighboring Maharashtra fell well below long-term averages. The black cotton soils that usually held enough moisture to carry a chickpea crop from planting to harvest dried out weeks early. Plants that had germinated began to wither. Pods that had set seed contained fewer grains. The grains that did form were smaller and lighter than normal. Farmers watched their fields turn brown and brittle under a sky that refused to open. The harvest, when it came in the early months of 2016, was dramatically reduced. Official Indian government estimates placed the chickpea crop at just over 7 million tons. That was down from more than 9 million tons the previous year. The shortfall was over 20%. Warehouses in the Mandis, the agricultural wholesale markets of Madhya Pradesh, sat half empty. Traders who normally filled gunny sacks by the thousand found themselves bidding against each other for whatever stocks remained. Prices began to climb. They climbed fast. In January 2016, the benchmark wholesale price for chickpeas in India was around 4,500 rupees per quintal. By April, it had crossed 8,000. The export price followed. The global benchmark for Australian Desi chickpeas, a close substitute for the Indian product, surged from $450 per ton in late 2015 to over $700 by the middle of 2016. That was a 55% increase in less than a year. Importers who had signed contracts at the old price found themselves unable to secure shipments. Governments in importing countries scrambled to find alternative suppliers. Australia, the world's second-largest producer, sold out its entire crop within months. Canada, Myanmar, Tanzania, any country with surplus chickpeas saw buyers materialize at their ports. But no one could fill the hole India had left. It was too big. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations tracked the crisis in real time. In November 2016, the FAO published its biannual Food Outlook report. The report noted that global pulse production had fallen sharply due to adverse weather in key producing countries. It singled out chickpeas as one of the commodities most affected. The language was dry and technical. The implications were not. Millions of households across South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa relied on chickpeas as their primary source of affordable protein. For a laborer in Karachi or a smallholder family in the Ethiopian highlands, chickpeas were not a snack or a side dish. They were the difference between adequate nutrition and going hungry. A 55% price spike pushed that staple beyond reach. Families reduced portions. They substituted cheaper, less nutritious alternatives. Children, pregnant women, and the elderly absorbed the hidden costs of a failed monsoon on the other side of the Indian Ocean. The drought in Madhya Pradesh had become a nutrition crisis in Cairo and Dhaka. The FAO report made another observation that few outside the agricultural research community had noticed. The global chickpea supply chain was extraordinarily fragile. It depended on a narrow genetic base. The high-yielding varieties planted across central India were closely related. They shared common ancestors from a handful of breeding lines developed in the 1970s and 1980s. If a new disease or a sustained climatic shift hit those varieties, there was little genetic backup. The old land races, the black chickpeas and red chickpeas and white chickpeas that Ibn al-Awam had catalogued in 12th century Seville, and that Vavilov had collected in the markets of Iran and Syria, had been largely abandoned in commercial agriculture. They survived in seed banks and in the cold storage vaults of research institutes. But in the fields where the world's chickpeas actually grew, diversity had collapsed. The 2015 to 2016 crisis revealed the cost of that collapse. A single weather event in a single region of a single country had sent shockwaves through the entire global food system. The chickpea that had spread across 3 continents over 10 millennia, adapting to every climate and soil it encountered, was now more productive than ever. It was also more vulnerable. The very efficiency of the modern supply chain had created a system with no resilience. When the monsoon failed over the Deccan Plateau, there was no backup. The local crop that had once been an insurance policy against wheat failure had itself become a global gamble. The 69,000 tons harvested from the fields of Puglia in 1938 had represented a peak of diversity and decentralization. The 7 million tons harvested in India in 2015 represented a peak of volume and concentration. The two peaks told the same story from opposite ends. One was the last great harvest of an ancient agricultural world. The other was the first great warning of a modern one. The FAO closed its November 2016 report with a call for increased investment in pulse research and greater attention to climate resilience. The recommendation was sensible and urgent, but it arrived decades after the genetic erosion it sought to reverse had already swept through the fields of the world's largest producer. The seeds Vavilov had collected were still sitting in a refrigerated vault in Russia. The Nero di Puglia was still grown by a handful of farmers in Apulia as a heritage crop. The wild Cicer reticulatum still clung to the limestone slopes of the Taurus Mountains, exactly where it had grown 10,000 years ago. None of them were planted in the black cotton soils of Madhya Pradesh, and the monsoon, which had failed once, would fail again. Theophrastus and Columella had been right about one thing. Chickpeas did exhaust the soil, but they had been wrong about the mechanism. Neither philosopher could have known about the bacteria living in tiny nodules on the roots of every chickpea plant. Those bacteria, rhizobia, pulled nitrogen from the air and fixed it into the soil in a form plants could use. The process was invisible to the naked eye. It was undetectable to any agricultural science that existed before the 19th century. And it meant that chickpeas, far from draining the land, actually replenished it. A field planted with chickpeas emerged richer in nitrogen than before. The ancient warning had been an illusion, born of incomplete observation. What Theophrastus and Columella had actually witnessed was a different exhaustion entirely. Chickpeas are deep-rooted and thirsty. They mine the subsoil for moisture and nutrients that shallow-rooted cereals cannot reach. Planted continuously, they deplete those reserves and yields collapse. The soil is not stripped of nitrogen. It is stripped of water and trace minerals that take years to rebuild. The Roman agronomists had prescribed a 2-season gap between chickpea crops. They had stumbled onto a correct practice for a reason they could never have identified. The irony in the modern era was this. Monoculture had undone the very benefit the ancients had misunderstood. When the high-yielding varieties spread across Madhya Pradesh after the 1970s, farmers abandoned the old rotation systems. Chickpeas followed chickpeas on the same black cotton soils, year after year. The rhizobia still fixed nitrogen, but the relentless extraction of water and micronutrients from the same depth by roots with identical architecture degraded the soil profile in ways the bacteria could not compensate for. The ancient fear of chickpeas as soil killers had been scientifically wrong. The modern application had made it practically true. The collapse of genetic diversity amplified the damage. The landraces Ibn al-Awam, catalogued in 12th century Seville, had evolved distinct root structures shaped by local conditions. The black chickpea of Apulia sent its taproot deep into limestone fissures. The red chickpea of the Syrian steppe spread its roots wide and shallow to catch rare rainfall. The white chickpea of the Iranian plateau matured fast and drew lightly on the soil before the summer heat arrived. Each of those varieties had been a solution to a specific problem. The high-yielding lines planted across central India were a solution to only one problem: yield per hectare. When the monsoon failed, there was no backup. The chickpea had once been a staple of emperors and peasants alike. Pliny the Elder catalogued its varieties for the libraries of Rome. Bartolomeo Scoppi cooked it with pepper and cinnamon in the papal kitchens. Ibn al-Awam wrote entire chapters on its cultivation for the libraries of Seville. Aurelius Serapion paid his taxes in it under the Egyptian sun. Sharecroppers in Tuscany survived on its flour when the wheat harvest failed. Street vendors in Nice baked it into thin crepes over open fires and sold it for a few centimes. Spanish conquistadors packed it in barrels as fuel for empire. The same seed fed the builders of Jericho and the dockworkers of Genoa. It nourished the legions of Rome and the monks of St. Gall. It crossed oceans and deserts and mountain ranges. It adapted to every soil and climate it encountered. And at every step, it carried a dual identity. It was the food of the poor and the ingredient of the wealthy. It was the tax burden and the survival ration. It was the crop mandated by emperors and the crop abandoned when wheat prices rose. The official version of the chickpea story celebrated its versatility. Museums and agricultural exhibitions displayed colorful maps of its global spread. Cookbooks praised its protein content and its nutty flavor. Government agricultural ministries published pamphlets touting its drought tolerance and its nitrogen-fixing properties. The documented reality was more uncomfortable. The chickpea had been carried across continents not by culinary curiosity, but by empire, taxation, and desperation. It had fed the builders of the first cities because it grew on marginal soils where nothing else would. It had sustained Roman legions because it dried hard and traveled well. It had spread through the Mediterranean not as a delicacy, but as the cheapest protein available to people who could afford nothing else. Its resilience had made it the crop of last resort, and that same resilience had allowed empires and governments to extract labor and taxes from populations living on land too poor for any other agriculture. The chickpea did not simply feed the poor, it made poverty sustainable. It allowed states to demand tribute from regions that would otherwise have been uninhabitable. It kept populations alive on degraded soils where wheat and barley would have failed. Its very hardiness became a mechanism of extraction. The 2015 price spike exposed how little had changed. When the monsoon failed over Madhya Pradesh, the burden fell on the poorest households across 3 continents. The laborer in Karachi, who could no longer afford his family's protein. The smallholder in the Ethiopian highlands, who planted chickpeas between rows of teff because the soil would support nothing else. The mother in Cairo, who reduced portions and prayed for the price to fall. The FAO report had used the language of supply chains and commodity prices. The reality was older. The chickpea had always been the crop you turned to when you had no other choice. And when that crop failed, you went hungry. The future of the chickpea now hung on a question no empire had ever needed to ask. Had humanity learned anything from 10,000 years of cultivation? The wild ancestor still grew on the limestone slopes of the Taurus Mountains. It still produced tiny seeds in explosive pods that shattered at maturity. It still carried genetic combinations that no breeder had ever catalogued. The Nero di Puglia still survived in a handful of fields in Apulia. Its black, angular seeds still tolerated heat and dry soil. Its rough, thick seed coat still protected it from pests that destroyed commercial varieties. The seeds Vavilov had collected in the markets of Iran and Syria still sat in a refrigerated vault in Russia. Each of the 1,500 accessions still carried a unique genetic blueprint. The breeding stations had produced varieties that yielded more grain per hectare than any chickpea in history. They had not produced varieties with the deep genetic resilience of the old land races. They had not bred for the unpredictable failure of the monsoon. They had optimized for a stable climate that no longer existed. The FAO report had called for increased investment in pulse research and greater attention to climate resilience. The words were correct and necessary, and decades late. The genetic erosion had already swept through the fields. The diversity that had carried the chickpea through 10,000 years of drought, disease, and empire was now a museum piece. It lived in cold storage and heritage gardens, and the germplasm collections of research institutes. It did not live where the world's chickpeas actually grew. The question was not whether the chickpea would face another crisis. The question was whether anything remained in the soil that could survive it. The breeding programs had calculated their yields under the assumption of reliable rainfall. The climate had already invalidated that assumption. In the refrigerated vault in Russia, the seeds Vavilov had gathered from a vanished agricultural world waited in silence. In the Taurus Mountains, the wild chickpea shed its seeds into the limestone scree. In Apulia, a farmer turned the thin soil and planted the black seed his grandfather had planted before him. None of them knew what the monsoon would bring next season.